He called me old and worthless in court, but my evidence turned the room against him. Margaret Turner stood on the worn steps of the courthouse, her fingers gripping the handle of a battered brown briefcase. It wasn't just any briefcase. It was a relic of a quarter-century spent navigating the swirling papers and tangled deadlines of Harrow and Klein, the law firm she'd quietly served since her 20s. Today, her silver-dusted hair caught harsh sunlight, and her trusty navy cardigan held together by a couple of loose threads felt heavier than usual. She wasn't here as a secretary anymore. Today, she was a witness in a contract dispute, thrust into a spotlight that felt too bright. The marble plaza buzzed with hurried footsteps and indifferent chatter as Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of eyes subtly measuring her, a quiet judgment that seemed more about her age than her expertise. She could almost hear the whispers beneath the hubbub, the unspoken, "she's past her prime." Her gaze flitted to the small red ribbon tied neatly to her briefcase handle, a fragile knot she had fastened herself years ago after her first successful case. It was a tiny defiance, a memory pinned close amidst the faded leather. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thick and sterile. Margaret's palms were clammy, her heartbeat sinking with the slow tick of the wall clock. She sat on the witness stand, the polished wood cold beneath her hands. Then she met the gaze of the opposing counsel, Seth Daly, a storm of youthful arrogance in a tailored suit, his mouth curled into a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. As he paced before the jury, loud enough for all to hear, he threw a barb that landed like a splash of ice water. "Let's just hope the old paperwork still makes sense to you, ma'am." A few muffled chuckles hovered in the courtroom like a cold draft, and Margaret felt her cheeks bloom crimson. Her throat tightened, words caught beneath the rising tide of embarrassment. She glanced down to steady herself, eyes lingering on her briefcase's ribbon, her talisman against doubts that weren't hers to bear. The judge's impartial gaze flickered towards Seth with a silent warning, but the damage had been done. The jury's eyes lingered a moment too long on her age, on the quiet suggestion that she was out of place here. Around Margaret, the tension rippled. She straightened her back, clasped her hands, and silently summoned every ounce of dignity she had preserved over the years. This was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a test of respect, of being seen beyond the silver hair and faded sweater. As the opening statements faded into the legal jargon that would stretch out the morning, Margaret's mind caught on the ribbon once more, its vibrant red humming quietly with promise. Somewhere inside that worn leather, amid stacks of files and forgotten notes, lay the key to turning this tide. But first, she had to weather Seth's sharp gaze and his calculated dismissal, and find her voice amid the subtle storm gathering in that courtroom. Seth Daly, standing tall and confident near the jury box, delved into his cross-examination with sharpened precision. The courtroom's tense air seemed to lean into his every word. Holding up a neat stack of contracts and notes, he snapped, "Miss Turner, given your years, you might agree that modern legal documentation has evolved far beyond the old methods some prefer, right?" His voice carried a patronizing weight as he glanced at the judge and jury, implying an expectation of agreement. Isn't it true that clerical errors are common when one depends on outdated filing habits? Margaret's fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles whitening. The room was warm, but a cold gust of self-doubt brushed across her. She met Seth's gaze steadily, reminded of the countless files she'd painstakingly organized, the deadlines met with quiet resolve. But Seth's intention was clear: to reduce her to a relic, unsure, unreliable, aged out of relevance. Even the judge's raised eyebrow caught Margaret off guard, a subtle reprimand in the middle of the verbal onslaught. Across the courtroom, Harriet, her supervisor, avoided eye contact, fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief as if shrinking behind walls of discomfort. No defense came, only the weight of silence loaded with disappointment. The courtroom's sterile lighting felt harsher now, highlighting every crease on Margaret's worn cardigan as if an accusation itself. Her throat tightened, but before the walls closed in, a gentle presence emerged beside her. Bailiff Miss Jordan, whose soft eyes contrasted with her stern role, stepped forward quietly and offered a cool bottle of water. "Take a breath, Miss Turner," she said, voice low but steady, a small island of kindness in the formal storm. Margaret's fingers closed around the familiar bottle, grounding her in the moment. She swallowed the bitter taste of doubt and forced a small nod, buoyed unexpectedly by that simple gesture of support. Seth, undeterred, shifted gears. He addressed the judge now with clipped words. "Your Honor, I'd urge this matter be resolved promptly. There's no value in dragging out what should be straightforward. No need for stale details lingering in testimony that's already questionable." His gaze flicked toward the jury, insistent on dismissal. The judge tapped a pen on the desk, signaling without words the pressure of an impending same-day ruling. This deadline hovered like a storm cloud, tightening the circle around Margaret's ability to prove her worth beyond his dismissive words. Margaret's heart thudded against her ribs, but that quiet nod from Ms. Jordan stayed with her, a silent promise that not everyone was blind to her dedication. Somewhere beneath the courthouse's haughty atmosphere, she found a sliver of strength to hold on to, that even in the face of disdain, kindness and justice might yet find a way. If a moment like this ever hit close to home, I'd love to hear how you found your way forward. The courtroom doors slid shut behind her with a hollow click that echoed in Margaret's chest. She retreated to the small corner where the jury and press couldn't reach, the quiet bulk of her briefcase a familiar wake against her hip. She dropped to a worn wooden bench, fingers trembling as she unbuttoned the clasp, intent on finding the receipt, a simple slip of paper that might finally prove the authenticity of the contract's filing date. But instead, she pulled out dog-eared folders filled with outdated notes, yellowed papers scrawled with old margin marks and scribbles long forgotten. Nothing with the concrete proof she desperately needed. Her shoulders sagged, and an ache settled deep in her chest, a familiar sting of inadequacy. Across the room, Seth Daly's team whispered behind folded arms, their glances sharp as knives. One of them caught her eye and sneered just enough that it nearly broke her resolve. The humiliation scraped raw. It wasn't just Seth's insults any longer, but the invisible line she was told she'd crossed, the one between useful and obsolete. For a moment, Margaret considered speaking quietly to her manager, Harriet. Maybe it was time to hand this over to someone younger, someone less vulnerable to attack. The thought hovered like a shadow she couldn't shake. But before she swallowed the words, a soft voice nudged her attention. Owen was standing there quietly, eyes fixed on hers with a cautious kindness built from years of mentorship. He leaned in close and muttered, "I overheard Seth bragging in the hallway. Said nobody ever checks stapler imprints nowadays." His words hung between them, casual yet loaded. Margaret blinked, her mind racing. Stapler imprints, of course, the small, distinctive pattern left by the office's old specialty stapler, the one she remembered signing out once because the standard ones jammed constantly. Seth had dismissed it as irrelevant, but Owen's offhand remark was exactly the kind of tangible detail she could use. This wasn't some vague memory. It was a concrete lead, a fact she could verify. If only she could get her hands on the office supply logs fast enough. The thought sparked a flicker of hope in the dark room. She glanced back toward the courtroom, steeling herself against the glances, the skepticism, the young lawyer's smirks. A quiet determination rose within her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If Seth thought his cheap jabs would topple years of experience, he hadn't counted on the quiet details hidden beneath the surface. Step by step, she could build her case. Margaret gathered her papers with slightly less tremble now and looked up at Owen. "We need to check that logbook," she said, voice steady despite the weight pressing on her. "If the staple matches, it'll be the proof we need." Owen nodded, giving a small, encouraging smile. "I'll help you. Let's check it out before the judge calls us back." As Margaret tucked her briefcase under her arm and followed him down the corridor, the sting of the courtroom faded just enough for her to breathe again. Beneath the surface, a quiet flame of hope flickered, small but fiercely alive. When dignity finally speaks, who tends to listen in your world? A low hum of the vending machine buzzed faintly in the otherwise quiet courtroom hallway. Margaret sat rigid on the cold wooden bench, the chill from the capital blue tiles seeping through the thin soles of her shoes. Her hands trembled slightly as she steadied her breath, but the more she tried to remember, the more slippery the details became. The receipts, those narrow slips of paper that could validate every word, were nowhere to be found. Her mind, so often her greatest asset, felt clouded and unreliable under the mounting pressure. Around her, muted footsteps echoed as court staff briskly moved between rooms, their distant voices blending into a white noise that underscored her isolation. She glanced down at the worn leather of her briefcase resting on her lap. The familiar warmth of the faded brown and its soft creaks gave a strange comfort amid uncertainty. Her fingers brushed against the old red ribbon tied with a small, deliberate knot to the handle. A keepsake from her first case, woven with years of quiet defiance and hope. Fingers trembling, Margaret reached inside the hidden inner pocket of that briefcase. Her palm touched paper, thin, musty, yet preserved. Carefully, she withdrew a sheath of backup document copies she had long forgotten tucked away beneath layers of more recent files. As she leafed through them, her eyes caught a detail she hadn't noticed before. A faint, distinct pattern left by a stapler on the corner of one copy. The impression was subtle, almost invisible in the court's harsh fluorescent light, but unmistakable. It matched the unique shape of an old, specialty stapler used only at Harrow and Klein. A piece of equipment she personally used and remembered requesting one season prior because the newer models kept jamming. The peculiar office supply order came back to her like a whispered memory. How the firm required a specific sign-out log for non-standard tools, a policy she'd kept strictly. The weight of that overlooked detail thumped through her chest, a pulse of clarity amid the fog. It was a clue, bound in simplicity, yet strong enough to challenge the assumptions being laid against her credibility. Her throat tightened, and the tremble in her hands shifted to a firmer hold on resolve. The faint buzzing of the vending machine faded into the background as a sudden surge of quiet confidence took root. No longer just memories or losses, this stapler's imprint was a symbol of meticulous care and knowledge only she possessed. She allowed herself a fleeting, hopeful glance at the ribbon, the thread tying past to present, reminding her that experience was not outdated, but an advantage. Just then, the courtroom doors creaked open again, and the judge's voice summoned her back. The moment was near, proof had shifted in her favor. But the battle was far from won. She rose, her breath steadier, the fragile glimmer of that seemingly insignificant stapler mark transforming into something far more powerful. If a moment like this ever hit close to home, I'd love to hear how you found your way forward. Margaret slid her fingers over the worn leather of her briefcase, the red ribbon, a small, stubborn knot tied years ago, resting against her palm, like a quiet witness to every late night and meticulous filing. The courthouse hallway felt colder as she stepped forward, eyes scanning for Owen. Their plan hinged on one thing: the office's stapler logbook, a relic of a long-ago policy requiring anyone who used the specialty stapler to sign out the tool. That log could link the unique staple pattern on the contract to her, proving the document's authenticity beyond Seth Daly's snide insinuations. She found Owen near the back, poring over his notes but alert enough to notice her approach. His expression softened, the eagerness in his eyes sparking some of her fading courage. "Let's head to the firm," she said quietly. "We need to check that log right away." The ride back was a blur of traffic and rattling thoughts. The downtown law offices, once a hive of steady rhythms and familiar rituals, felt oddly distant now. The reception area smelled of polished wood and fresh coffee. Margaret's hands clutched the briefcase tighter, as if drawing strength from its worn surfaces. Inside the supply room, Owen pulled a dusty binder from a locked cabinet, the stapler logbook. Pages filled with neat rows of names, Dates and times greeted them. Margaret's eyes scanned urgently. There it was, her signature beside the date 2 months prior, right before the disputed contract was signed. A small note in the margins caught her attention. Specialty model BBX 200 stapler, assigned to Margaret Turner. Their discovery was promising, but the deadline weighed heavy. They had less than 24 hours to present undeniable proof before the judge would decide the case. Failure was not an option. If the signature didn't hold up or the timeline didn't align, Margaret's decades of service and her professional reputation would be dismissed as obsolete. Owen glanced at her, concern flickering momentarily behind his steady support. "Are you ready for what happens if this doesn't go our way?" Margaret offered a faint smile, more to herself than to him. "I've come too far to back down now." The risk was high, but so was the reward. This logbook was more than a piece of paper. It was her lifeline. Outside the office window, the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows as the tension inside built toward a decisive moment. Whatever came next, Margaret was no longer alone. The pieces were in place. All that remained was to see if the truth could pierce the courtroom's walls of doubt and skepticism. Margaret sat upright in the witness chair, the crisp courtroom light casting faint shadows across the pages she held steady. Her eyes met the judge's, then the jury's, each face a mosaic of skepticism and curiosity. From the corner of her eye, she spotted Seth Daly's confident smirk, but she no longer felt its sting. Today she had facts on her side. She reached calmly for the worn logbook, its spine creased from years of use, and laid it gently on the polished table. Then, with steady hands, she spread the uniquely stapled contract copy beside it. A document that had been dismissed before, but now spoke louder than words. "I want to draw your attention," Margaret began, her voice clear and composed, "to the policy regarding specialty office equipment usage at Harrow & Klein. Only those who sign out the item in our log are authorized to use it." She tapped the logbook page, her finger landing on her own signature, dated 2 months before the contract was signed. "As you can see, I signed out the BBX 200 stapler for that period. The staple on this contract matches the distinct pattern this model leaves. No other stapler in the office could have produced it." Murmurs rippled gently through the courtroom. Seth's confident posture stiffened. He glanced sideways at his senior partner, who gave a subtle shake of the head, an unspoken admission that the tide might be shifting. Margaret's gaze returned to the jury. "This is not just about staples," she continued quietly, "but about accuracy, trust, and the responsibility we carry in preserving facts." She held the contract copy up slightly, as if to let its authenticity speak on its own. The faint staple pattern was no longer a forgotten detail, but a clear marker that only an attentive and experienced hand could identify. Seth fumbled with his papers, the edge of his composure fracturing. His earlier barrage of dismissive remarks now felt hollow against the evidence Margaret presented with quiet authority. Even the judge's expression softened, the subtle raise of his eyebrows transforming into approving attention. The room's atmosphere shifted, the jury leaning forward, jurors exchanging glances weighted with newfound respect. No longer merely the old secretary, Margaret had become the steward of truth in that space. As the tension eased, Margaret felt a surge of calm triumph. The methodical gathering of overlooked details, the quiet persistence against doubt, had brought her to this moment. The evidence she presented was simple but irrefutable, a testament to experience that no youthful bluster could diminish. "Has anyone ever judged you too soon? Tell me what changed their mind." Margaret's hands held the contract and stapler log steady on the judge's bench as he leaned in, eyes scanning every page, every signature. The room held its breath. Seth Daly's confident posture trembled imperceptibly. His earlier smirks now faded into uneasy glances at the assembled faces. The judge's fingers traced the unique staple pattern on the contract, then shifted to the matching entry in the logbook. A silence fell, deep and absolute. "Miss Turner," the judge said. His voice, low but firm. This evidence is thorough and convincing. It confirms the authenticity of this document beyond reasonable doubt. He looked up, gaze meeting Margaret's with a rare warmth and respect. This court relies on careful, experienced hands to uphold the truth. And today, you have done just that. Across the room, the managing partner of Harrow and Klein stood slowly, stepping forward with a solemn nod in Margaret's direction. His eyes conveyed years of unspoken respect, now openly acknowledged. Harriet, Margaret's supervisor, hesitated before crossing the courtroom floor. Her earlier silence softened into a quiet apology as she offered a tentative, grateful smile. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I should have spoken up sooner." Seth shifted uneasily, his usual composure now cracking. He murmured apologies, voice barely audible over the courtroom's renewed murmurs, acknowledging the clear victory Margaret had secured, not just for herself, but for the integrity of the entire case. The courtroom atmosphere changed. Margaret was no longer the quietly overlooked secretary, but the rightful steward of the truth, defended by evidence and earned respect. The jury's nods grew more assured as the weight of the proof settled in. Words no longer mattered as much as the undeniable facts she presented. Margaret exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and pride warming her chest. The months of doubt and the sting of dismissal had led to this moment of justice. Her resilience had transformed humiliation into vindication. In that instant, she reclaimed not only her professional worth, but her dignity, etched visibly on every face that now regarded her as a pillar of knowledge and integrity. The courthouse steps glistened under the late afternoon sun as Margaret stepped outside, the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders. She clutched her worn briefcase, the brown leather softened by years of use but still sturdy, and her fingers brushed the red ribbon tied to its handle, a small, steadfast symbol of her journey. The ribbon caught the light briefly, fluttering in the soft breeze like a banner of quiet victory. Around her, familiar faces from Harrow and Klein gathered, Owen among them, his smile warm and genuine, now carrying newfound respect that transcended the youthful admiration he'd shown her before. Others from the firm approached with nods and smiles, their earlier doubts replaced by recognition of the persistence and integrity she had displayed. Harriet stepped forward too, her eyes sincere, offering a small, meaningful apology that said more than words. Margaret's chest swelled with a sense of restored dignity, but it was tempered by humility. Years of being underestimated had not hardened her. Instead, they had taught her endurance and kindness. She realized now that true respect wasn't handed out lightly, nor forced by loud declarations, but earned quietly, through unwavering belief in one's worth, and the courage to stand firm when shadows tried to dim the light. As she looked out over the city skyline framed by the courthouse steps, the red ribbon on her briefcase fluttered again, echoing its earlier presence in the courtroom, a subtle yet powerful reminder that her value wasn't measured by age or appearances, but by the perseverance and integrity that defined her. Margaret's pace quickened, her steps lighter, each one carrying that renewed dignity not just for herself, but for every colleague and young woman who might one day face a similar trial. The ribbon, once a memento of a distant past, had become a beacon of a reclaimed future. If a moment like this ever hit close to home, I'd love to hear how you found your way forward. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button. See you in our next story.